Good evening. Welcome to Know Before You Grow, a committee of Petaluma Urban Chat. I'm Dan Like, and as always, thanks to Sharon Kirk, Dave Alden, and the host of other people who actually make this happen, rather than me just hosting the Zoom. A couple quick notes. First off, we have been Zoom bombed. We like to encourage an open atmosphere and not be draconian about our attendance standards, which maybe means we may be Zoom bombed again. If things get weird and your screen goes blank. What? If things get weird and your screen goes blank, hang in there. I'll get things opened up again as fast as I can. And if you get booted and think you shouldn't be, come back in. There will be a waiting room and we'll make sure that happens. And somebody is chatting without being muted, so I'm going to mute. And that's my other job here. So yeah, my job is largely to watch in the background and catch the people flushing their toilets and mute them before that gets too loud. This evening is the third in our general plan series, 20 months of forums intended to help Petaluma residents better understand the topics that will be addressed in the general plan update and become better advocates for land use future they want for our town. 2 weeks from tonight, forum number 4 will talk more about the environmental context for the general plan. And on Wednesday, May 12th, we'll be talking about transportation. And I'm back to the waiting room to admit all. If you're interested in helping us plot, plan, and organize, we'll also be informally gathering virtually tomorrow at noon for a chat in this same URL. For the full calendar, check out the Urban Chat website at urbanchat.org. There's also some good background material, definitions, and such to help better understand what we're talking about. If you're not yet on the email list, sign up for that, because that's probably the best news about what's going on in town you're going to find anywhere. Because this series is about the general plan update, we expect many members of the City Council, Planning Commission, and General Plan Advisory Committee to attend. We love that they're here. We also respect the intent of California's public meetings rules and ask that questions be framed around broad land use issues rather than specifics of how the general plan should be written. Thank you to Josh Simmons and Petaluma Civics rebroadcasting this on Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube. Toss the questions in the chat. We'll monitor those and put them there and bring them up and bring them into the conversation. And now to the purpose of this meeting. Allie Gaylord, Regional Manager of Affordable Housing Developer Mid-Penn Housing, has organized our talk for this meeting or this evening. And Allie, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm so glad we have so many people that are interested in housing. Housing is a really hot topic and is top of mind as we go into this housing element cycle and a lot of the general plans that are being updated to coincide with that. I'm Allie Gaylord, and I'm joined by my co-moderator tonight, Lizzie Wallack. I've been in the affordable housing industry for 18 years, and I'm an East Side Petaluma resident. I'm currently serving on the GPAC and a board member of Generation Housing here in Sonoma. Lizzie holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Furniture Design and a Master's in Architecture, and has been a design professional for over 10 years. She works in the Greater Bay Area and throughout California. And she lives on the West Side, so we've got all the representation here, with her 2 kids and her dog, Ruben. Tonight, we're joined by 2 great speakers to help frame the housing context for us, how we got here, and some of the cost implications too. First, we are going to kick it off with Aaron, who is from California, YIMBY. And after that, we will go to Duncan from Wright Contracting. So Aaron, I'll pass it off to you. Oh, and also just a reminder, put your questions in the chat. I know Dan just said that, but we want to just make sure that folks are asking a lot of questions and that we're recording them. Lizzie's going to take over and do the Q&A after both presentations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Allie. Thank you for inviting me. It's really great to be here virtually with all of you to talk about housing issues. My name is Aaron Eckhouse. I'm the Regional Policy Manager with California YIMBY, stands for Yes in My Backyard. Can everybody see this presentation?
Yes,
Excellent.
It's showing up here.
All right. So California YIMBY is a statewide advocacy and organizing group. We believe that California is for everyone, that we have room for more neighbors and we welcome more neighbors, and that our housing crisis is a major barrier to California being a place that is truly for everyone. We can't be a state for everyone if we are not a place where everyone can find a safe and stable and affordable home. So we work with at the grassroots, grass tops, academic, policymaker level to advance housing policies that will move us closer toward that goal, to a place where California is affordable for everyone. What is our housing crisis? You know, when I first started working for California YIMBY a couple of years ago, there were still places where it was controversial to suggest that we had a housing crisis. I think and I hope that that is no longer the case. I think that was something we're all familiar with now, but I do think it's worth sort of dwelling on just how bad it is here for a minute. California has an estimate of 3.5 million homes that we are short. That's homes that we needed to build over the past decades to keep pace with our growing economy and our growing population. Number one source of population growth in California is the old-fashioned kind, it's people having children. And we have just consistently, decade after year after year after year, failed to keep pace with our needed housing production. You can see, we think 180,000 homes a year is sort of the bare minimum just to keep track. And we are building less than half of that in recent years. It's a huge shortfall, and it leads to a huge number of problems. It's driving up rents. That leads to displacement of people from communities where they've grown up and where they have sort of social ties. It pushes the cost of homeownership out of reach for millions of Californians. California has one of the lowest rates of homeownership in the entire country. It forces people into overcrowded living conditions, which we've seen over the past year has been a major contributor to the spread of COVID-19. And it pushes people farther and farther away from the places where they want to live, where they work, and into extraordinarily long commutes. I live in Oakland. In the Bay Area core, we have a lot of people commuting across the Altamont Pass every day, average of 120 miles round trip every day. I'm sure that super commutes are an issue that you're very familiar with in Petaluma as well. These are all consequences of our, also as well as homelessness. California has 25% of the national homeless population compared to 1/8 of the national population. That's directly related to the fact that we have a very high rate of rent burden in our state. 1/4 of California renters are severely rent burdened. That means they're paying over half of their income in rent every month. All of this is a direct consequence of our housing shortage, of the fact that we have over the past several decades failed to build the homes that we need. There we go. The housing crisis is man-made. And unfortunately, it's often intentional. California is an incredibly wealthy state. We have the resources to build the homes that we need, but we don't have the policies to put those resources to use. There's a whole series of policies that have been put in place over the years to restrict housing, often with the explicit intention of excluding lower income people and people of color from specific communities. On the left here, we have a redlining map from Santa Monica and Western Los Angeles. So if you're not familiar with redlining was a policy around mortgage lending that divided neighborhoods into different levels of desirability. The areas in red were the less desirable areas. Those are typically areas that had a higher share of Black residents. And the areas in green and blue were the most desirable areas. And those are often areas that had explicit racial covenants to keep people out. There's also an explicit mention in these redlining maps of zoning standards. The green and blue areas are typically areas that had restrictive zoning that limited the type of housing that could be built in those communities, whereas the red and yellow areas had more permissive zoning that allowed apartments to be built, sometimes right next to existing single-family homes. That was considered something that made the neighborhood less desirable and could lead to infiltration, is often the word that they used. So as a result of these, over the years, we had sort of a succession of policies with the purpose of restriction and exclusion, from redlining and explicit racial covenants that specifically said, no people of Oriental or Jewish or African origin in this neighborhood. When those are struck down, cities turn to other policies, and in particular, restrictive zoning. They said this neighborhood will be exclusive. This neighborhood will be exclusive for one housing type, and that is detached single-family homes on large lots. That turns out to be the most expensive housing type to produce. It requires a lot of land. Land in California is expensive. It limits the amount of housing in that neighborhood, which drives up the cost. And as a result, we see a direct relationship between restrictive zoning policies and both higher costs and higher levels of racial segregation to this day. So we also see in recent years sort of a spread of the housing crisis up the income level. We went from something that was primarily a crisis for extremely and very low income Californians to something that is affecting more and more middle-class Californians. And as a result, it's become more and more a pressing issue for elected officials at all levels. In response to the growing housing crisis, the California legislature has done a number of things to try to address the rising cost of housing and create more housing opportunities for Californians. Some of those have been things that are direct action. So like ADU laws in California are something that the state has just done. They've taken that out of cities' hands. You have to allow accessory dwelling units now in California. But a lot of what the legislature has done has been tied to local planning processes like the general plan update and specifically the every 8-year requirement for cities to update their housing elements in order to demonstrate their ability to meet their regional housing needs allocation. So I'm going to talk about a series of laws that have been passed over the last couple of years that affect the general plan update process and specifically housing elements. I'll just do a quick review here. So SB 828 is a bill that California EMB supported. It passed a couple of years ago. Its purpose was to bring the regional housing need determination process, the process by which the state identifies how much housing each region in the state needs to plan for as part of the RHNA process, and make that better reflect the actual housing needs. I think most people will agree that the amount of housing the Bay Area had to plan for in the last RHNA cycle was inadequate to our needs. And the state wanted to do something about that. So they passed a law for the regional housing need determination to take into account additional factors, particularly overcrowding. I mentioned earlier, California cities have extremely high rates of overcrowding. Los Angeles is the major metro in the state that has the worst overcrowding, but San Jose and San Francisco metro areas also have very high rates of overcrowding for a country as wealthy as the United States. And the existing levels of housing cost burden. The result of that is that the regional housing need determination for this cycle is about in the Bay Area is about 1.5 times higher than it was in the last cycle. We're going to have to plan as a region for a lot more homes, and that extends to every community in the Bay Area. They passed another bill, AB 686, to try to force cities and regions to account for the historic patterns of segregation that I mentioned. This incorporates a mandate into the RHNA process from the allocation to the housing element stage for cities and regions to affirmatively further fair housing. This is a standard that comes from the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And it says it's not enough to just stop discriminating. You have to actively repair the legacy of segregation and discrimination that are built into your land use policies from past generations. You have to pass policies that will affirmatively help low-income people move to areas of opportunity and bring opportunity to concentrated areas of poverty. This is really important because one, it's steered more of the regional housing need determination to cities with a history of segregation and exclusion. And it also means that cities can't just plan for housing in maybe the same places that they always have, areas that are often lower income and have less political capacity to resist. But cities have to be making an affirmative effort to plan for more housing and particularly affordable housing in their highest resource neighborhoods and neighborhoods with a history of exclusion. We have a couple of laws here, SB 166 and AB 1397, that change the standards for sites that cities use in their housing element to require them to take feasibility into account. So, you know, we have a city that has proposed that they are going to redevelop their city hall for affordable housing. That's a pretty unlikely thing. You know, they're using the city hall. They might propose that they're going to redevelop a hospital. Again, the hospital, if the hospital is currently in use, that's not actually a good site for affordable housing. So the state is going to be applying greater scrutiny as cities identify opportunity sites for affordable housing in their housing element to make sure that that's actually a viable site. And they're going to be watching the fact that many cities might identify a site with a certain capacity, but then when it gets developed at a lower capacity than that. And so they've identified a no net loss standards, where if a city has identified a site as being, you know, suitable for say 100 new affordable homes, and when it's actually developed, they only produce 50, they need to identify where those 50 homes that they didn't build on that site are going to go instead. And then the last one is to make this planning process mean a little more. Cities, the state has reduced the ability of cities to arbitrarily deny housing proposals for housing development that are consistent with their housing element and general plan and zoning. This is both the Housing Accountability Act that people may have heard of, where cities can't arbitrarily reject a proposal. And also you may have heard of SB 35, which creates a streamlined ministerial process for approving housing that is consistent with the zoning if it meets certain other standards and depending on other standards in the city. So what this means for Petaluma is that the draft allocation for the next housing element is 1,910 new homes. I have here the breakdown of those across different income levels. That's a 150% increase from the last RHNA cycle. And it's also twice as much housing as Petaluma has built in the current housing element cycle to date. So Petaluma is doing better than a lot of other cities in terms of meeting their goals, at least in the aggregate. There's a significant shortfall in the very low and low income end of the spectrum. But even so, Petaluma is going to need to identify a way to do more than they've done over the past 5 to 8 years. And there's going to need to be a buffer. So it's not enough to just zone for exactly 1,910 new homes worth of capacity in your housing element. You're going to need a buffer to account for both the no net loss standard, where if a site gets developed below that, you don't want to have your housing element fall out of compliance, and to account for the fact that we know that not every site in the housing element is actually going to be developed. And so you need to identify more sites that will mean that even if not every site is developed, you still meet your goals. Petaluma is going to enter the next housing element with an SB 35 determination of streamlined development for streamlined ministerial approval for developments with at least 50% on-site affordable housing. That's because Petaluma is on track to meet its moderate and above moderate income numbers from this last RHNA cycle, but it's falling behind on very low and low income. I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that Petaluma has, like, sometimes you hear this presented as, oh, our city has built too much market rate housing. That's not what it means to be on track to meet your RHNA goals or exceeding your RHNA goals. It doesn't mean you built too much housing in that income category. It just means that you are doing an adequate job for what the state has determined is the minimum standard. So because Petaluma is going to need to plan for a significant increase in housing production and zone capacity compared to the last cycle, I think it's worth thinking about what are some of the policies that Petaluma could look at, and what have other cities done when they've been faced with a need to increase housing production. I'm going to look at one policy in particular. There's a lot of different things that can be done, from, you know, expanding ministerial approval to affordable housing overlays, to rezoning commercial sites, to funding sources. I'm going to look at one in particular, which is Plex zoning. So Plex zoning looks specifically at neighborhoods that are zoned currently exclusively for single family housing. And it looks at allowing small scale multifamily housing, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and similar in those neighborhoods. You may have heard of missing middle housing. There's a graphic here from Opticos Design at the bottom. The idea here is that this is a housing type that is similar in scale to existing single family homes, but can house more people. You'll see duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes are sort of at the, Plex Zoning is at the smaller end of missing middle. There's sometimes a tendency to talk about them as if they encompass all of missing middle, but there is actually more to missing middle zoning than that. Duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes are on the smaller side. We advance these policies, one, because they allow us to create more affordable housing by design, and particularly housing that is affordable to moderate income households. That may be essential public employees like teachers, nurses, firefighters. It allows us to undo land use patterns that are rooted in segregation. So I talked about the need to affirmatively further fair housing. Single family exclusive zoning was often put in place with an explicitly exclusionary intent, and it continues to lock people out. The Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, I'll show you a map from them on the next slide, has found a direct association between the prevalence of single family exclusive zoning in a city and the level of segregation in that city. And it creates more diverse housing options for both rental and home ownership opportunities. So right now, the origin of the term missing middle is that sometimes in our cities, we have detached single family homes and we have mid-rise podium apartment buildings. And the mid-rise podium apartment buildings are great, but they don't meet the needs of everyone. And they're also a more expensive housing construction type than this wood frame missing middle housing like plexes. So it's a more flexible design type. The biggest reason though is just the fact that the vast majority of land and the vast majority of cities in California is currently zoned exclusively for one house, which means you can't really build more housing there. In Petaluma, that's 73% of the residential land in the city that's zoned for single homes exclusively. That's actually a little less than the average in the Bay Area, which is around 80 to 85%. But it's still really high, right? That's 73% of the land in Petaluma. The local zoning says is off limits to new homes. There's been some modification to that with ADU laws, but ADUs are limited in size and scale, and they don't provide homeownership opportunities, which means also you can only add an ADU if you're willing to be a landlord. So plexes that create more flexibility for both homeowners to maybe sell half their lot, and also for people looking to buy a home. Those of you who are familiar with Petaluma geography, you'll have a better sense than I do whether that zoning pattern, how it maps onto the socioeconomic geography of Petaluma, but something to think about. So this is something that a lot of cities in California are looking at. Sacramento was the farthest along. They have adopted this into their general plan update, they're still working on the specific ordinance, but Berkeley has expressed an intent that they want to do this in their housing element update, as has Oakland. And then South San Francisco, Sunnyvale, San Jose, and Santa Monica are all exploring the idea. None of them have really detailed policies that we can refer to, but they're all looking this for some of the reasons that I've mentioned, to create more diverse housing options, to address exclusionary land use history, and to add a new tool for people looking to build more housing. The city I'm gonna look at the most is Portland, because they have, I think, the most developed and the best Plex zoning ordinance. But Minneapolis has also done this citywide, and Austin has sort of one that's specifically for nonprofit developers. So this graphic explores what Portland did. I'm gonna point to the things that I think are really important and talk about how that compares to what other cities have done. So one, Portland did this citywide. I think that's really important for two reasons. One, this is a policy that creates small changes on any given lot. And so if you limit it to only a small portion of the city, in the aggregate, you're going to get really small changes. Most of the affected lots aren't going to change at all. The ones that do, you're only adding maybe 2 new homes. So you need that really broad base if you want it to add up to something significant. It's also significant because we've seen when these policies are geographically targeted that targeting often reinforces the history of segregation and exclusion that we want to fix, that we want to, and we want this policy to be a part of solving that history and not reinforcing it. Portland, when they enacted this policy, they actually reduced the scale of building allowed from what the base zoning, the existing zoning in their city had. So they combined this as a sort of an anti-McMansion policy and also an affordable housing, more affordable housing policy. They did something I think that's really interesting and significant, which is they allowed you to build a larger building if you put more homes in it. And that sort of graduated FAR policy was estimated. Sightline Institute is a housing think tank in the Pacific Northwest. They estimated that it would create 10 times more housing as a result of that change, because it made it more worthwhile for developers to build more homes rather than a single large house that might sell for a little more per square foot. They also added a provision to allow up to 6 plexes with 50% on-site affordable housing. And so this is only for a nonprofit developer like Habitat for Humanity. It creates a regulatory subsidy for them. They have standards around accessibility. They incorporated ADUs into this. They did cottage clusters, which are, you know, you can, instead of having one building with 4 homes in it, you could have 4 separate buildings, which is sort of, some people prefer that. And they removed off-street parking requirements, which is really significant because if you want to do small lot infill development, parking can be a real barrier to that when you start having, you know, 1 or 2 parking spaces per home. It eats up a lot of the available lot area, and then all of a sudden you don't have any space left to actually build housing. This 6-plex with 50% affordable housing is what Austin has done as well. And the flexibility in form, I think, is really significant. You'll see here, right, there's an option to do it as townhomes even. That's a housing type, these townhomes and 6-plexes, that have demonstrated success in Portland in creating new housing that is affordable to middle-income households without any public subsidy. So we've seen examples in Portland where a house was replaced with a Plex, and the new homes produced in that were affordable to a median income household in Portland without requiring any public subsidy, which I think is really exciting. Different cities in California are exploring different facets of this. Some of them are looking at that affordability bonus, some of them are not. Some of them are looking at changing the FAR and setback and lot coverage standards. Some are not. I think changing those standards is generally a best practice. The standards that we have currently for single family homes may not fit multifamily housing, and we may want to revisit that. I think the parking is also a really important best practice. All of this, I'll note, is achievable with the same construction type that currently builds single family homes and goes into remodels and flips. One of the reasons that Portland estimated their policy would reduce displacement risk is because it would redirect energy that is currently going into flipping existing single family homes and turning them into mansions, and redirect that policy into creating new homes and reducing the pressure on the existing housing stock. You'll notice there's no city I'm aware of yet in the North Bay that is investigating this policy, but you know, there's always room for someone to take the first step here, and I think this is a really exciting idea that is catching on in California and has a lot of potential to expand our housing choices. I hope that I'm on track and on time. And that's everything for me. Hope this was interesting and informative, and happy to take questions when that's the appropriate time.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron. That was super informative, and thanks for the graphic illustrations as well. We'll move on to Duncan Young now to give us a kind of construction perspective. I think Aaron talked a little bit about the construction types and the associated costs, so I think this will be a great segue to Duncan's information that he can share. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Can you guys see the screen and hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. So as introduced, I'm Duncan Young with Wright Contracting. We're actually building something down the street from a lot of you guys right now, River City, which is the illustration here on the cover. So I'm going to be talking about kind of my perspective of mainly low income and affordable housing from the context of a builder. My background's a little weird. I was actually went to college at CCA and got my architecture degree and became a licensed architect, and then transitioned over to being a contractor. So I have a lot of experience on kind of both sides of the table, which kind of makes my perspective unique in this category. So the elephant in the room for everyone is costs. And I deal with this as pre-construction manager for our company every day. I get, 100 calls a week about how much things cost. And right now it's a crazy time. It's really hard to say what things cost. Every day it changes. But in a general sense of things, historically, there's been a pattern. And that's what I'll talk about, aside from the sort of day-to-day blips. We do a lot of multifamily housing, PEP housing, worked for MidPen in the past, a lot of others. Right now, we're seeing the cost trends at around $400 to $450 a square foot for multifamily. We've seen things go up. Obviously, building systems has a major impact on cost, but right now, honestly, we're seeing wood framing. Wood costs have skyrocketed. So it's hard to say what's more cost effective these days, but most of the stuff we're building is all wood framed. And single family in the Plex zone, we don't do a lot of the smaller stuff, but in our experience, it's a little more expensive. It depends. You don't get the economy of scale that you get when you're building, 70 or 80 or 100 units. Especially when you get into the site work package. But I think the single family or the Plex package, as Aaron was referring to, is going to be the next sort of step in this affordable housing or mid-affordable housing category that we haven't really seen explode here in the Bay Area, in the North Bay especially. So in terms of the ratio of material to labor, it's all over the map depending on when, but 50-50, 60-40 is a typical breakdown. Obviously, we get into the cost of labor, and that we'll get into that in a little bit about labor costs based on prevailing wage or non-prevailing wage, union, et cetera. That has an impact on labor costs, but I'll get into that in a minute. So the big asterisk there, everyone hates the asterisk, but every job is different and every location and site is different. I mean, we wish we could have a flat, site for every place we built a multi-family or large building. It makes it a lot easier with good ground, but that's usually not the case, especially with River City right next to the river there. So, there's a lot of drivers for the cost ranges. The site, parking is something that we started to talk about here with Aaron. Parking is a huge issue with the cost of this. I mean, it's a land acquisition issue. It's you need more land for cars. It becomes something that it's the bane of our existence. It's how do you fit the cars on the site? And I know it's the bane of a lot of designers' existence too. So that's something that, if that could get solved, could bring costs down a lot, just because you don't need as much land. And then labor. The labor drives the cost a lot as well. Escalation, that's something that we've been talking a lot about lately. Material, labor, soft costs. A lot of times these jobs are priced years in advance of getting a general contractor on board. And so we come into the picture and price something, and the owner has a budget. And the budget is often a lot lower than what we come in with, because in the last 5 and 6 years, we've just seen costs escalate substantially. With labor, with material, across the board, soft costs, permitting, entitlements, everything's been going up. So I've been trying to convince owners and owners reps to build in, if not in our budget, in the owner's budget, escalation over time, because rarely do you get a budget in real time that matches what the owner has set aside. And often we get criticized for not meeting budget goals, but when we price something that's, you know, been designed 2 years ago and the owner has a price from 2 years ago, that there's no way we're going to match that price. So that's something that I try to preach about is building escalation to the cost of things. And then we have regional issues specific to our area. We really only build in Sonoma, Napa, Marin, and Lake counties. So we have a pretty good finger on the pulse of how things are around here. All of our subcontractors are local. We pride ourselves on not really traveling across a bridge to do work. We try to keep all of our labor and our money flowing back into the local economies. That being said, the cost of living around here is high, which drives labor costs up. And material costs and availability of labor has been an issue, especially with the fires. The fires keep artificially inflating the market for all of those things. That coupled with COVID and now shipping and issues with international trade, they've caused a lot of issues that are factoring in the regional category. And then zoning. Zoning is a regional issue. I am by no means an expert in that. Aaron, I think, did a really good job of outlining some of the needed changes in our area that will help mitigate some of the issues we've been talking about. But obviously zoning, it makes it hard to find a spot to build this stuff. And you can see by the graph there, I mean, you can just see the inflation. It's just gone straight up. It's a crazy statistic. So site improvements. A major component of our costs and our biggest risks on site when we're building these multifamily structures are the site improvements. There's, you know, power. Often there's an aerial to underground aspect. There's existing utilities on site or power poles that need to get undergrounded to vaults. And PG&E needs to get involved, and often that stuff doesn't go very quickly. So that's a component of the whole situation. SWIP, which is stormwater protection protocols and such. We want to foster an environment as well, but the SWIP issues have and requirements have definitely driven up costs. So as we get more protective of some of these regulations, it causes a domino effect of costs, which we've seen increase sort of year over year. And we're doing a much better job of keeping water on site, but it does come at a cost. Another, you know, aspect to take into consideration is the topography of the site. You know, most of the sites we work on are relatively flat, but we've had a few multifamily housing sites that are not. And those throw the cost models way out of skew when you've got a lot of cut and fill or retaining walls. Those can add significant percentages to the overall cost of the project that folks don't always take into consideration when planning these things out. Geotech. So really what that means is the quality of the subgrade. So often we'll be required, and it's not necessarily in the budget, but once we start digging, the geotechnical engineer will require all kinds of additional measures: over excavation, soil treatment, soil remediation, over compaction, lime treating, cement treating. These are things that make owners crazy, make us crazy, because they're hard. Do we plan for them up front and blow the budget and not get hired? Or do we talk about it as a group? Often that doesn't work because it's a design bid build. So we don't have that conversation early. So it comes up as we're digging, and those are crazy cost drivers and make everyone crazy. Often hard rock has been an issue as well. We've done jobs, we've run into significant hard rock that don't show up on geotech reports. So, you know, geotechnical issues, most of you are probably aware, are huge drivers. Start date, believe it or not, the start date of the project has a huge impact on the cost. We have a lot of owners who try to just say go, go, go in the middle of winter, and we end up with a lot of these geotechnical requirements that are above and beyond what the original scope of work was. So often we'll have to over excavate or lime treat or cement treat the fill material to make it suitable to work through the wet winter. Often this allows the owners to stay on a schedule, but not necessarily on budget. So often we like to start at the end of the rainy season, obviously. Some jobs are just so big that you can't get through all the earthwork in one cycle, and that's just is what it is, and we work with it. Specs on material. So we've seen an interesting push in the last few years of some very unique materials, a lot of it site related, fusion piping, et cetera. People like to litigate, so it's pushed the consulting community to using products that are more expensive, perform much better, but we've seen more and more unique products specified that have a huge cost impact recently, which is interesting. So as I note here, we typically see the most risk in this phase of construction, site improvements, site phase, and it's where we see the most change orders, which is a word that no one likes. So I'll talk a little about wages, funding, and contract types, dear to my heart. So obviously, the funding source for these projects determines a lot of the wage requirements. Prevailing wage, we're actually a union company, so we deal with a lot of prevailing wage jobs. It's not foreign to us. Davis-Bacon, that's a different federal related wage requirement. If there's federal funding involved, that drives the price up, which has an impact on overall cost. We like to think that these requirements of having prevailing wage allow a higher standard of work. I know there's a lot of debate about that, and that's probably a whole separate forum to talk about that. But we do like to be a part of supporting the living wage. So we think it's great when it's a prevailing wage job. Some of the contract types. This is an interesting one because historically we see the design, bid, build model where an owner hires a design team, they design it, done. Then goes out to bid, a competitive bid process where contractors are trying to get as low as they can go because they're rewarded by getting the job if they're the lowest bid. Now, this is something that has been going on for 70 years. And then the contract is awarded and it's built. Now, those of us who have been in those jobs know that that makes for a triangulated relationship where folks, it's not always collaborative. Folks are trying to cover their rear end, and a lot of times it leads to not good relationships between the GC and architect, and the GC and owner, and the architect and owner. So it's this triangle of issues. So in my experience, we've done a lot of different models. Design build, that's definitely an attractive model. We do a lot of design build work, both in school worlds and in other worlds where we take on all the liability as the general contractor. We hire the architect, we hire the consultants, we hire everything. The only thing we don't do is get the geotech report done, basically. And that allows the owner to mitigate some of the risk. And we've seen that become more and more popular in the last few years. It's been popular for a long time, but as it relates to public works, we're starting to see it take off a bit. So that's interesting. We'll see if that model continues to grow, and we like it. And we think it's better than design, bid, build. And then there's another model that we've seen also take off a little more lately, which is a hybrid approach of a pre-construction / partnership approach, which leads to a GMP. So what is a GMP? For those of you that don't know, it's a guaranteed maximum price. Just a type of contract between an owner and a contractor that guarantees that based on this set of drawings, we're going to build the job based on the set of plans for this price. And it allows a little bit of negotiation, it allows a contingency, and it allows an iterative budgeting process that if the GC is on board early, they can be a part of and create budgets at milestones of schematic design, design development, construction documents, and then the final phase. So that along the way, as the project's being designed, the contractors is putting in their 2 cents about the feasibility, the constructability, the cost, so that at the end of it, you're not left with a project that's unfeasible, which we run into all the time. We price something and it's, you know, millions of dollars out of the budget. So we're huge proponents of this. We just actually got hired for a large scale low-income housing job here in Napa that's using that approach, and we're hoping that it's going to be successful. So happy to talk more about that too in the Q&A. So how can we make it easier? Obviously from the perspective of a builder. Well, easing parking, another planning related restriction that adds substantial costs. I think a lot of you already know a lot about this. Developers are hemmed in with what they can do and how much it costs. And I think, you know, through the next few cycles of general plan updates throughout the Bay Area, we'll probably see these restrictions ease to allow developers to pencil this stuff out better. Because at the end of the day, that's really what it comes down to: is this stuff pencil out? Folks that are actually investing in this, they need it to pencil out. We're huge proponents of getting a general contractor on board early. Obviously, we're general contractors, so we like that, but it actually saves money at the end of the day. I'm a firm believer that a hard bid job is going to cost the same as a GMP at the end of the day. It's just going to be a lot more painful getting there. Be decisive. Getting decisions made in a timely manner as it relates to design is a huge problem we see continuously across all jobs. Getting someone as a decision maker to be able to make these decisions save a lot of money. Hiring quality consultants. We see all the time on public jobs that the consultant with the lowest bid gets the job and it's a complete disaster. And this goes from mechanical, electrical, plumbing, waterproofing. We have so many waterproofing consultant issues, it's not even funny, where we've had to make recommendations to replace people. So we firmly believe that a best value approach is the best. You don't always get the most bang for your buck for the bottom dollar consultant. And I think owners and stakeholders should take more value in the fact that they're hiring consultants that can provide better drawings and a better end product. And then the last item I'll touch on is expediting plan review and inspections. So this is something we run into, and in every jurisdiction it's different. But if we could get plan review and plan changes, especially plan changes once we have a permit, expedited, it would save us in the field a ton of headaches. So many times we come up with ASKs, SSKs, changes throughout the design process, and then we're at a standstill because it goes back through a typical permitting process and it drives everyone crazy. So I feel like there could be a very simple mechanism that allows these types of jobs to operate at a different level, at an expedited level, that will benefit everyone and save everyone money, which at the end of the day is what we're all after here. So that's my presentation. It wasn't as long as Aaron's, and it was definitely not as graphically pleasing as Aaron's. So that's what happens when you stop being an architect and become a contractor. You lose your graphic design skills. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions and when it's appropriate time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Duncan. I'm going to jump in actually and just ask the first question. As you and I were speaking about the affordable housing project that Wright is starting to do in Napa, and this idea of a design build process for multi-unit affordable housing. I think that in my practice on a small scale, building more and more, what I'm doing is engaging contractors early on, because we can design till the cows come home, all day long, but we're not building the project. And so we need that constant feedback and pushback. And I think it's brilliant to start doing that on a larger scale. And I'm curious to know how that process works with the city, and who are the people that brought the team together. And have the architects done this process before, and a little bit just kind of what does that look like? Who's sitting at the table making decisions?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in low-income housing, we actually haven't really seen it before. This is the first project. So Monarch Monarch Landing is the project for Napa Valley Community Housing that we were hired for pre-construction on, which is just getting going. And Pound Management, which is a construction management firm that we have a long history of working with, has pushed this idea, which I think is also brilliant, that we do this in other forums all the time. We do a lot of hospitals, we do a lot of schools, we do a lot of wineries, we do a lot of hospitality jobs this way. Why should we treat low-income housing any different? We see it benefit and pay off on in these other contexts. Why not in housing?
Mhm.
So an individual at Pound Management actually used to live and work in the low-income housing world. So she's taken the knowledge and now she's working for a construction manager and is looking around saying, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we going this design, bid, build, stipulated sum, hard bids process where everyone's always angry at the end? We get a poor product and it ends up costing the same. So, you know, I think it's going to take a concerted effort to convince these larger development companies that this works, because I don't think they're all on board of it yet. And I don't think there's a full trust in the contracting of the contractors that it'll work, frankly. So I think there needs to be more trust in that.
Thank you. I'm going to scroll through the chat in here. There's quite a few statements that I'm just going to read off, and either you or Aaron, feel free to jump in. Kenneth Munson has stated, how about not rezoning local industrial areas where local jobs are located and creating from light industrial to housing? Better to focus on higher density nearer downtown and transportation and creating transition buffers between the two. Sharon has stated, parking is still a big impediment to creating housing. I'd turn my home into a 2-flat, but can't meet the parking requirements to do so. And I think that maybe parking would be great for both of you to weigh in on, in the sense that, A, we need to be moving away from, you know, multiple cars in a household. We need to be having electric vehicles and the infrastructure to afford that, as well as designing development to be accessible to places where people need to be without being car dependent. So how to start to move toward, you know, on a policy end, to get away from designing in an old way and constructing in an old way, and to now kind of pave the path for the future of not a car dependent world of construction and housing requirements.
I guess I can start. I mean, I think we both talked about parking requirements as a barrier to both good design and affordable housing. I think a thing that we haven't touched on is that they're also kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of car dependence. If you require a parking garage attached to every new home, every new shop, every office building, everybody, they will fill with cars. People will, you know, buying a home with a 2-car garage, I guess I might as well have 2 cars. Although I guess nobody in California actually parks in their garage. If the shop, if my grocery store is surrounded by an acre of parking, that's the easiest way to get there. And it's, you know, it's easy to drive, and it's hostile if I want to ride my bike there because I have to navigate across this massive parking lot. And so we create this feedback loop where we require everything to be built around cars, and then everybody drives, and then look, everybody's driving. We have to plan everything around cars. And in order to break out of that loop, we have to plan for a future that is less car centric. So I think with housing and with retail and with office, all of them, like those parking requirements, they make it harder. They're an active barrier, not only to affordability, but also to a land use pattern that is more conducive to people getting around by walk and bike and transit.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is, because when you do get rid of the parking requirements, where do people park? And that's the issue we always come across. I think we are headed for a massive shift. I'm not sure if it's in my lifetime, but hopefully so. Where public transportation is something that's viable in our area, more viable than it is today, and that where people don't need as many cars as we think we need. But I can see how city planners struggle with the issue, because I've been in a lot of cities where there is no parking and it's a nightmare. You want to park. So I can see the riddle here, and I think we're in the growing pains of trying to figure it out. I'm hopeful that we will figure it out, because I think there's enough of us who want to figure it out.
Thank you. Another question from Carol. Westside Petaluma has 2 historic districts. How do you protect the architectural and historic buildings while integrating and adding multifamily?
I think one thing we see is that I would bet, I don't know for sure because I've not been, but I would guess that there's multifamily housing in those historic districts already. Because for a very long time in American cities, that was how they were built. This rigid separation of uses was something that arose primarily after World War II, as fair housing laws began to chip away at some of the other barriers that had been put up. So I think there are ways you can do adaptive reuse of existing structures. You can subdivide. You can set architectural standards for new buildings as well. I don't know, I'll defer to the contractor here in terms of whether it's, my sense is that if those standards are clear and upfront, they can be worked around. What becomes a challenge is that they're like ad hoc review that takes a year, during which you're sort of sitting on the land, paying interest and watching construction costs go up. That becomes a problem. But if you know what you have designed for from the get-go, I think that's something that's doable for cities to reflect the existing architectural style. Because we can't just say like nothing changes in these areas, right? Because change is upon us, whether we want it or not. It's only a question of whether we try to steer it in a positive direction or just let it smack us in the face.
Yeah. Another question from John. Can we get a plan that is agreed by all stakeholders first, from city to neighbors to developers, to set site-specific goals and get the compromised agreed upfront with streamlining all processes? Can this be done organized by city planners or committee?
I think it's something you could do in the housing element process, right? Like the idea of the housing element process is you're identifying sites that are suitable for housing development and affordable housing development, and you are identifying the capacity of those sites. It's sort of a dependent on a little, like the details of the plan you can work on in advance are going to be dependent on staff capacity. But one thing that Sacramento did as part of their process is they actually expanded streamlining to anything under 200 units is subject to the same streamlined process as SB 35, where it's just a ministerial checklist by the staff. The staff goes through and they say, this conforms to the underlying zoning. It has the right setbacks. It has the right height limit. It meets all of our applicable codes. You don't have to go through the discretionary approval process. Mm-hmm. And that can be really significant in terms of the delays that we heard were a risk factor for cost escalation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if you can do the planning up front in the housing element, right? Like this site is suitable for 5 stories, and this site is suitable for 3 stories, and this site may be suitable for 8. And then when something comes along that is actually consistent with what you have identified in this community planning process is suitable for the site, you don't make it go through a whole process all over again from the get-go. You say, well, okay, we decided that this kind of thing belongs here, and so If you meet those standards we set, you get your approval.
Okay. We're at exactly 8 o'clock. So I just want to check in with everybody. I'm scrolling through, and I do, if anybody has a last question that they're dying to ask, either Duncan or Aaron, please raise your hand now or quickly type it in the chat. But I think I got through most everything. There are some great comments and back and forths within the chat that everyone can go back through and read. But I think that as of now, we'll call it good. Does that feel right with you, Dan and Sharon and Dave, Allie?
I think this has been a tremendously good presentation, and the fact that we don't have a whole lot of questions indicates that a lot of the questions were answered in the presentation. And yeah, this was really good for me. Yeah, thank you very, very much, everybody, for your time. And obviously, I will take the questions and put them in the comments to the YouTube video when I upload the YouTube video.
Great. And so, yeah, so everyone can go back and read the, watch this or share it and reference some of the stuff, because I would say this presentation was excellent and content dense.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was great. Thank you, Aaron and Duncan and Lizzie and Allie. It was really, really informative. Nicely done.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Duncan and Aaron.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Have a good
Go ahead.
evening.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great to come in and chat.
Great.
Okay. Be well.
Thanks, Ian. Bye-bye.
Good night, all.